We were talking about Nussbaum and the way in which she says that this language of rights doesn't really allow us to articulate the benefits or the quality of life or even establish comparisons between region to region, right? So the language of rights, she says, doesn't really apply when we're thinking about rights about entities, families, ethnic, religious, or linguistic groups, and nations, right? They apply the language of rights, again, is this liberal approach that is centered on the individual. So if we have a communitarian approach, if we have groups like the indigenous groups in Bolivia who have been trying to make the case that their tribe has a certain kind of life and that kind of life ought to be protected, not the individual, but that kind of life that they deserve. Nussbaum says that rights are not really amenable to that sort of discussion. She also says that if we are thinking about side constraints or goal seeking actions, rights aim to improve quality of life, but there is no way in which we can actually see that that quality of life has been improved, right? And we use the language of rights in order to guide countries into the democratic life. Think about the kinds of wars that we are having right now in the Middle East. But she says that that language of rights is vague. We know what it means to have the right to freedom of speech, for example, just to connect that a little bit to Mill, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into a different life or that it is the right that culminates into a democratic life, right? That democratic life maybe is bigger, the version is heftier than what the language of rights allows us to see. And then this idea of the correlation between rights and duties. If I have a duty, if I have a right, do I have a duty as well? How, and if I have duties, does that mean that I have by implicit transaction already duties? Already rights, right? So, oh, I know I'm being tripped because I have a mistake there. If the US has a duty towards me, what is my right towards the US, how are these articulated, who am I supposed to respond, do I have a duty towards a country or do I have a duty towards the citizens of the country, right? Do I have a duty towards the ideals of the country or do I actually have a duty to respond in manner to the citizens that confront me on a daily basis? So that's what this correlation between rights and duties means. What is, if I have a right to bear arms, right? Is that right to bear arms more important than my right to desire sensible legislation on this matter? Can I have both? Are rights and duties in some way clarifying the language of the way in which we ought to live? Because definitely in recent discourse, it doesn't seem to be the case that rights open up the conversation for something else. People seem to use the language of rights to claim what belongs to them, right? And if it only belongs to them, then how do we articulate life in a bigger sense, right? So when we talk about rights, and I'll run through these really quickly because they have already been touched upon in the previous slide, do I claim that I have a right to be treated in a certain way, to a certain level of achieved well-being, right? Or that I have certain resources, opportunities, and capacities that ought to be handy for me in order to be able to say that I actually enjoy, possess the right, right? So if I have a right to feel safe in the environment in which I am, if I am a Latina woman who is not a citizen of this country, which is my case, how does that right exist in relation to me? if it's a right to be treated in a certain way and feel free of harm that can come my way, our Muslim population seems to be waiting for the next strike to come their way, right? When it comes to being treated in a certain way, how does that apply to gay and lesbian people and the way in which they connect to one another, the kinds of rights that they have? It seems that this language of rights doesn't really allow us to have conversations with others. It allows us to make claims, but it doesn't open up those conversations to something else. So this is the advantage that Nussbaum wants to bring up when she talks about the capabilities approach, right? The capabilities approach is going to allow me to talk about the abilities to do and to be certain things that are deemed valuable. And these, like, to do and be phrase is embedded in a really, really hardcore Aristotelian perspective of what a human being ought to be able to do or should become, right? So I just wanted to mention, when we read Aristotle initially, it was like these, I think you all remember, because most of you disagreed with his view, obviously, of man is the master and is supposed to rule over women and slaves, right? But one of the things that is interesting about Aristotle is that he sees human beings as having this potential to become better people, to flourish in society. And he sees that the role of society, he mentions this when he says that we are a political animal. He sees that what we ought to do as people is treat each other in such a way that that potential can be achieved. So this is what the capabilities approach aims to do. How do we make sure that that person actually becomes all those things that they could be? How do we thrive in society, right? And Nussbaum says that their motivation, or her motivation, right, is to be able that we can talk about the living standard and how to make comparisons between one nation and the next, because obviously the living standard is not an abstract objective absolute. It depends on where you are. The living standard for us living in New York includes high rents, high pressure, running from one place to the other, right? And you might find yourself that you are happy, willing, and able to be in this city. But if you move to a Midwestern town, the living standard is going to be different. It doesn't necessarily mean that one standard is better than the other, right? Or that my salary here, if I were to move with the same salary to a Midwestern town, I would make so much money. But that comparison doesn't matter, right? Because things in New York are way more expensive. Things in some Midwestern cities are way less expensive. But I would obviously be paid less if I moved to a Midwestern and got a Midwestern job. And I'm just saying Midwest because in the US, I feel like I come from Chicago, right? So in order to make comparisons across different nations, across different cities, rights don't really help us. Do I have a living standard that allows me to feel successful, to thrive, and to flourish in New York as it would allow me to flourish and thrive in Chicago? Then we're talking about something we can actually understand, right? So capabilities inform us of that type of equality that matters. Not like, I'm going to move on to the next slide because I think that her point is really poignant when it comes to contrasting the capabilities approach to talking about the GNP and how the GNP shows the stability and development of nations, right? Think about the quotes that Farmer uses in his chapter, right at the beginning of the chapter, right? The GNP might be increasing in a country, but that doesn't mean that all its society, that all its citizens have seen an increase in their power to purchase or in their lifestyle, right? So this is why she thinks that the GNP is not, which has been the traditional way of measuring countries, she doesn't think that that is a good way to approach the situation. She also doesn't think that utilitarian models work because they measure quality of life in terms of satisfaction. So just measuring quality of life becomes really problematic. uh, Satisfaction and desires come up as like a totally separate point that she wants to make, because Sen has said that people's satisfactions are not reliable. My satisfaction today can vary tomorrow if I decide to marry or have kids, right? So my satisfaction with New York right now as a single woman who has a full-time job might be totally different to my satisfaction with New York as a married woman who has two kids and has a job that doesn't maybe allow her to get everything she wants for her family or like to spend time with her kids, right? And then there's a middle point that there's a commitment to commensurability of value that we have, according to utilitarian models, that we have to pay attention to the numbers. So Nussbaum also wants to talk about how even if we have a Rawlsian approach, and this is all I'm going to mention about Rawls, it wouldn't allow us to see that people are actually in effect happy within that society. So a Rawlsian approach would talk about the distribution of basic resources. And this is based on what Rawls called the inequality principle, right? In a society, you are going to have inequalities. He thinks that there's no way of undoing inequality, right? But he says that those who are better off and those who are worse off should be working in such a way that the worse off don't become even worse off when the better off improve. So the Obama administration, with the taxation of the people who make more than 250K, was trying to work with a Rawlsian approach. If we tax people who have already a guaranteed stability, and we use those resources to improve those who are worse off, to bring them to a bearable level, right? So that they're not in the level of like under poverty or sinking below the poverty line. If we use that tax money to provide for a better standard of living for those who can't provide on their own, then we're actually making the whole of society better. So that's the point here. Do those inequalities work together or against one another? The way in which we see them working right now is that they actually working against each other. We have this very strongly independent will to I pull myself by the bootstraps, so if I can do it, anybody should be able to do it. So our inequalities in this kind of society are not working for the better. In societies like Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, right, Norway, you can argue that maybe in their case, this inequality is being used in order to create some common threshold for the whole of society, that no one would ever fall below that line where their humanity is protected. So Nussbaum says that even this approach, even if it were working, it wouldn't actually tell us what A is actually able to do, what the person actually gets from being in that society. What would that mean? What would that be like if we were actually able to have it? And this is why she wants to move us to an Aristotelian account and the way in which capabilities work with that. So I'll be back for maybe a 5 minute video on the Aristotelian account and how capabilities work with Aristotle's theory of potential, the potential that humans have.